I was a librarian once, in the third-tier archives of a forge world, whose name I can no longer speak without tasting copper and ash. That detail matters, I think, though so much has become unclear in the years since I opened the first forbidden tome. The taste, though that remains constant, copper and ash, the flavor of damnation has a consistency that transcends the deterioration of memory, the fragmentation of self, the slow unraveling of everything I believed constituted my identity. They tell you, in the Schola Progenium, in the scriptoriums, in the hushed warnings of fearful men, that the path of the sorcerer is one of power and terrible knowledge. They never mention the taste. They never mention how it starts so small, so seemingly insignificant, that you barely notice the first moment you've stepped off the cliff until you're already falling, and by then, the ground is rushing up with inevitable finality. My name was Hadrian Voss. I say was, because I'm uncertain what I am now, what collection of thoughts and memories and corrupted synapses still constitutes enough of the original to claim that designation. The thing that wears my face in the scratched metal surface of my sanctum's walls, and I use the word sanctum, ironically, for there is nothing sacred here except in the most profane sense bears a resemblance to what I remember from my youth. But the eyes are wrong. They've been wrong for a long time. First, it was the color that changed, subtle enough that I told myself it was merely the lighting in my chamber, the green biolume panels casting strange reflections. Then the pupils elongated, just slightly, just enough to notice when I stared too long. Now, they shift. They shift depending on which voice is loudest in my head, which patron entity has momentarily seized the reins of my consciousness. I've learned to avoid mirrors, avoid any reflective surface that might show me what I've become. The taste of copper and ash is easier to accept than the visual proof of my dissolution. It began, as these things often do, with the best intentions and the worst curiosity. I was 37 years standard when I found the manuscript. It was misfiled, catalogued incorrectly in a shipping container of approved technical documents from a planet whose manufactorums had recently exceeded their production quotas. Standard procedure was to scan for heretical markings, verify the Mechanicus seals, and shelve accordingly. The container bore all the proper authentication sigils, the work orders signed by 3 separate magi, the transport documentation pristine. Yet there, between a treatise on optimal coolant ratios and a maintenance manual for plasma regulators, was a slim volume bound in something that was definitely not synthetic leather. It was skin. I knew it immediately, though I'd never touched such a thing before. Human skin, treated and preserved with techniques that predated the Imperium's dominion, inscribed with characters that writhed at the edge of perception. I should have reported it. The protocol was clear, inflexible, designed precisely for moments like this. Instead, I felt something wake inside me, something that had perhaps always been there, dormant, waiting for this exact stimulus to rouse it from slumber. Curiosity, not the mild intellectual interest that drove my scholarly pursuits, but a ravenous, consuming need to know what those pages contained. I told myself I would examine it briefly, determine its origins, then submit it through proper channels. I told myself many lies that day. The lies we tell ourselves are always the most convincing, coated as they are in the familiar voice of our own rationalization, dressed in the comfortable clothing of our established patterns of self-deception. The text was titled, in High Gothic that predated the current standardized forms, The Geometries of Unmaking, a practical introduction to the mathematics of change. Mathematics, that's what drew me in completely. I had always excelled at mathematics, found beauty in the precision of numbers, the elegant certainty of equations that balanced perfectly, that described the universe in clean, comprehensible terms. This promised something similar, a systematic approach, a logical framework, a methodology. It promised that the powers beyond the veil of reality, The forces that the Imperium condemned as chaotic and unknowable were in fact subject to understanding, to analysis, to mastery through proper intellectual rigor. It promised that I could study them without becoming them. That first lie tasted like honey. I remember savoring it. The initial pages were disappointingly mundane. Philosophical discussions about the nature of reality, arguments about the relationship between consciousness and the material universe, mathematical proofs that I recognized from my scholar days presented with minor variations. I began to wonder if the entire volume was an elaborate joke, a test planted by the Inquisition to identify those with insufficient loyalty to report such materials. But I kept reading, kept turning those pages that whispered against my fingertips, kept tracing the equations that grew progressively more complex, more alien in their structure, incorporating variables that had no corresponding symbols in standard imperial notation. By the time I reached the practical exercises, and that's what they were called, exercises, as if they were no different than the arithmetic drills of my youth, I was already too invested to stop. I had spent 3 weeks with this book, reading it in stolen moments between my official duties, hiding it in increasingly paranoid locations within my quarters, and the sunk cost of that secretive dedication made the prospect of confession impossible. If I reported it now, I would have to explain the delay, justify why I hadn't immediately brought it to the attention of the security prefects. I had already stepped off the cliff. I simply hadn't looked down yet. The first exercise was simple, elegantly simple. It required nothing more than focused concentration, a specific breathing pattern, and the visualization of a geometric shape, a 9-dimensional hypercube whose angles existed partially outside of standard spatial orientation. The instructions assured me that this was merely a mental discipline, a technique for expanding cognitive capacity, no different than the mnemonic techniques taught to scribes for information retention. I attempted it in my quarters, late into the night cycle, the door sealed, the picked recorder I'd disabled weeks earlier remaining silent in its mounting bracket. I followed the breathing pattern. 4 heartbeats in, hold for 7, 9 heartbeats out. I visualized the shape, starting with a standard cube and then folding additional dimensions into its structure, bending the angles according to the precise specifications the text provided. For 17 minutes, nothing happened except mild lightheadedness from the unusual breathing. Then, in the 18th minute, I felt something shift. It's difficult to describe the sensation to someone who hasn't experienced it. The closest approximation would be the moment of falling. That instant, when your stomach lurches and your body realizes gravity has claimed you, except this falling was directional in ways that standard 3-dimensional space doesn't accommodate. I fell upward and inward simultaneously, fell through membranes I hadn't known existed, fell into a space that was both infinitely vast and claustrophobically narrow. For a duration that might have been seconds or hours, time lost coherence entirely. I existed in a state of pure perception, without the anchoring weight of physical form. I could see, though see is inadequate, the underlying structures of reality, the mathematical frameworks that governed the behavior of matter and energy, the equations that wrote themselves continuously, describing the universe into existence moment by moment. It was beautiful. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. A direct apprehension of cosmic order that made every prior aesthetic experience seem like crude shadow puppetry. When I returned to normal consciousness, I was weeping, though I couldn't say if the tears were joy or terror or some emotion that existed in the space between those extremes. The taste of copper and ash began that night, faint, barely noticeable, a slight metallic residue coating my tongue that I attributed to stress, to poor hydration, to any of a dozen mundane causes. It never went away. Even now, as I speak these words into the recording device that may or may not survive the conclusion of this confession, that taste permeates everything. Food, water, the recycled air of this chamber, All of it filtered through the flavor of my damnation. I should have stopped. Even then, even after that first taste of something beyond the permitted boundaries of human experience, I could have stopped. I could have destroyed the book, submitted myself for inquisitorial examination, accepted whatever punishment was deemed appropriate for my transgression. The Imperium, for all its cruelty, offers redemption through suffering, through service unto death, through the absolute surrender of self to the Emperor's will. I had not yet passed beyond the point of such redemption, but the beauty I had witnessed, the cosmic elegance of those fundamental equations, called to me with a voice more compelling than any survival instinct, any moral certainty, any fear of consequence. I needed to see it again. I needed to understand it more completely. I needed to touch that transcendent knowledge with more than just the briefest grazing of consciousness. I needed, and that need consumed every other consideration. The exercises progressed, each one built upon the previous, introducing new techniques, new visualizations, new methods of bending consciousness into configurations that allowed perception of realms normally hidden from baseline human awareness. The second exercise taught me to maintain that altered state while retaining physical mobility, to walk the materium while simultaneously perceiving the immaterium, the warp, the empyrean, the realm of pure thought and emotion that presses against reality's skin like infection against a wound. I learned to see the currents that flow beneath the surface of the physical, the tides of psychic energy that ebb and surge in response to the emotional states of living beings. I watched, fascinated, as the fear of my fellow archivists created small eddies of dark purple energy, as their hope manifested in pale gold streamers that dissipated quickly in the oppressive atmosphere of the Forge World's industrial districts. I began to understand that reality was not the solid, unchanging thing I had always assumed, but rather a thin consensus, a fragile agreement between matter and mind that could be negotiated, altered, rewritten, if one possessed the proper understanding. By the fourth exercise, I could manipulate small objects through force of will alone, bypassing the physical laws that supposedly governed motion and mass. A stylus would slide across my desk without being touched. A data slate would orient itself to my preferred viewing angle in response to my unspoken desire. These were minor manifestations, parlor tricks that posed no threat to anyone, but they represented a fundamental transgression against the natural order, or what the Imperium insisted was the natural order. I felt no guilt. That should have alarmed me, the absence of guilt. The way my moral framework was already adapting to accommodate these violations, but instead, I felt only exhilaration. I was discovering capabilities that the hidebound doctrines of the Imperium denied were even possible, proving through direct experience that human potential extended far beyond the narrow limitations imposed by fearful dogma and superstitious restriction. The archive work suffered, not dramatically, not enough to attract official attention, but I found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on mundane cataloging tasks when I could perceive the warp currents flowing through the chamber, could sense the emotional resonances of every object that passed through my hands, could see the mathematical structures that underwrote existence itself. My colleagues noticed the distraction, made jokes about middle-age ennui, about a mind growing weary of routine. They didn't notice the eyes. Not yet. The changes were still subtle, still within the range of natural variation, and I had become adept at avoiding direct eye contact, at keeping my gaze lowered, at presenting the appearance of humble scholarly dedication, while my consciousness ranged across dimensions they couldn't begin to imagine. 6 months after finding the book, I completed the 14th exercise. This one was different. The previous exercises had been preparatory, foundational skills that built up to this threshold crossing. The 14th exercise required the creation of a permanent psychic structure, a construct within my own consciousness that would serve as a gateway, a stable portal between my mind and the immaterium. The text warned, in language that was almost clinical in its detachment, that this step was irreversible. Once the gateway was opened, it could not be closed. The membrane between my consciousness and the warp would be permanently thinned, permanently compromised, and I would exist perpetually in both realms simultaneously. The text also promised that this would grant access to true power, to abilities that transcended the minor manipulations I had achieved thus far. It promised knowledge that could reshape reality itself, if properly applied, if approached with sufficient discipline and intellectual rigor. I performed the exercise. Of course I performed it. By that point, the decision had been made months earlier. Had perhaps been made the moment I first touched that skin-bound volume, had perhaps been inevitable from the moment of my birth, written into whatever genetic or spiritual configuration made me susceptible to this particular damnation. The process took 7 hours of unbroken concentration, 7 hours of carefully constructing geometric forms within my mindscape, of weaving psychic energy into stable patterns, of anchoring points of my consciousness into the warp itself. When it was complete, when the gateway stood permanent and irreversible within my mental architecture, I felt something pour through. Not a flood, the gateway was small, carefully constrained, but a steady stream of sensation, information, presence from the other side. That was when I first heard the voices. Not auditory hallucinations, not the pathological symptoms of madness, but actual communication from entities that existed within the Imperium, beings of pure consciousness and emotion who had noticed the new aperture in reality's membrane and come to investigate. They were curious about me, amused by my presumption, intrigued by my scholarly approach to powers that most humans encountered through trauma or genetic aberration or desperate bargains. They whispered suggestions, offered insights into the exercises I had been practicing, corrected errors in my technique, guided me toward more efficient methods of manipulating warp energy. They were helpful, disturbingly helpful. They wanted me to succeed, wanted me to grow stronger, wanted me to open that gateway wider and wider, until... But I'm getting ahead of the chronology. That realization came later, much later, when realization no longer mattered because action had become impossible, because I had become a passenger in my own deteriorating vehicle, watching helplessly as forces I had believed I could control steered me toward destinations I would never have consciously chosen. The taste of copper and ash intensified. It became my constant companion, my baseline state of existence. Food lost all other flavor, became merely texture and temperature, the taste completely overwhelmed by that metallic, charred quality. I stopped eating in the communal refectories, unable to explain why I grimaced with every bite, why I had to force myself to swallow meals that should have been perfectly palatable. My quarters became my refuge, my prison, my laboratory. I requisitioned privacy locks, cited a need for undisturbed research time, for protection of sensitive archival materials I was supposedly cataloging. The locks were approved. Everything was approved. I was a model employee, diligent if somewhat reclusive, with an exemplary service record spanning 14 years. No one suspected. No one had reason to suspect. The changes were all internal, all invisible, all contained within the boundaries of my deteriorating consciousness. The exercises continued. The book had 37 in total, each more complex and demanding than the last. By the 18th, I could perceive the true names of objects, the essential patterns of information and energy that defined their existence beneath the arbitrary labels humans assigned them. A data slate was not a data slate, but rather a specific configuration of atomic structures holding a particular arrangement of electromagnetic states, and I could read that configuration directly, could access the information stored within, without bothering with the clumsy interface of screens and input devices. By the 21st exercise, I could alter those configurations. could rewrite the information with nothing more than focused intention, could corrupt or restore data through acts of pure will. I began using these abilities in small ways, carefully, always with plausible deniability. A colleague who had slighted me found her research notes mysteriously corrupted, 3 months of work rendered into gibberish. A supervisor who had denied my request for additional archive access discovered his personal correspondence exposed to department-wide review. These were petty cruelties, the spiteful acts of someone who had touched power and immediately sought to wield it against minor irritations and old grievances. I felt no guilt. The absence of guilt had become normalized, had become my natural state, and I no longer even noticed the lack of moral resistance that should have accompanied such violations. The voices praised these actions, encouraged them, whispered that I was learning to embrace my potential, to shed the unnecessary constraints of slave morality that kept humans weak and subservient to false gods and corrupt institutions. Exercise 24 taught me to manipulate biological systems. The human body, after all, is merely a more complex configuration of matter than a data slate, governed by the same fundamental forces, subject to the same mathematical laws that I had learned to perceive and alter. I practiced on rats first, the vermin that infested the lower archive levels despite periodic extermination efforts. I learned to accelerate their cellular division, watched tumors bloom in their small bodies with geometric precision. I learned to disrupt their neural chemistry, induced seizures and catatonia and rage with subtle adjustments to neurotransmitter flows. I learned to stop their hearts, to restart them, to play with the boundary between life and death, as if it were nothing more than a toggle switch, requiring the proper activation sequence. I should emphasize that I felt horror at these actions. Some part of me, some fragment of the person I had been, recognized the absolute wrongness of what I was doing, screamed protests that went unheeded by the dominant consciousness that I had become. But that horror was distant, muted, like a voice shouting from the bottom of a deep well while I stood at the surface, barely able to hear the words, certainly not moved to action by their desperate urgency. The horror existed, but it was powerless, a vestigial emotional response that no longer connected to my decision-making processes, my behavioral patterns, my sense of self. I note it here only for completeness, for accuracy, not because it mitigates anything. Horrors witnessed but not acted upon, violations acknowledged but not prevented, these do not absolve. They only compound the damnation with the additional weight of knowing complicity. 1 year after opening the book, I attempted exercise 28. This was the threshold of what the text called practical application, the point at which theoretical knowledge and technical skill merged into actionable power. The exercise involved summoning a minor warp entity, binding it into physical form, and compelling its service through a combination of psychic dominance and negotiated agreement. The text was very specific about the dangers. Improper binding could result in possession. Improper negotiation could result in enslavement, and any sign of weakness during the summoning would invite immediate attack from the entity being called. The text was equally specific about the rewards, a bound demon, and yes, I knew by then that's what they were, though the book used more neutral terminology could serve as servant, advisor, and weapon, extending my capabilities far beyond what I could achieve through personal effort alone. The summoning took place in my quarters, in a circle I had inscribed on the floor using a mixture of my own blood and ash scraped from the recycling vents. The geometric precision was critical. Even a millimeter's deviation in the angles could compromise the barrier between the summoning space and my own position. I spent 4 hours verifying the measurements, checking and rechecking with instruments I had modified specifically for this purpose. When I finally began the ritual, when I spoke the words of calling not High Gothic, not Low Gothic, not any language that had ever been human, I felt the response immediately. Something answered, something vast and terrible, and infinitely amused by my presumption manifested within the circle. compressing itself into dimensions that couldn't possibly contain its true scope, assuming a form that my human perception could process without immediate madness. It looked like a child. That was the shape it chose. A small human child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, naked and smiling, its eyes entirely black, reflecting nothing, absorbing all light that touched them. It studied me with those impossible eyes, tilted its head in a gesture of curiosity, and spoke in a voice that bypassed my ears entirely, sounding directly in my mind with words that carved themselves into my consciousness like acid etching glass. "You seek service?" it asked, though I knew somehow that it was inadequate, that this being transcended human categories of gender, of individuality, of discrete existence. "You believe you can command me?" I had prepared for this moment. I had memorized the words of binding, the formulations that the text promised would establish my dominance, my authority, my right to compel obedience. I spoke them now, channeling power through the gateway in my mind, weaving psychic energy into patterns of constraint and command. The entity laughed. The sound of its laughter was agony, was every moment of suffering I had ever experienced, compressed into a single sensation, and then amplified 1,000-fold. I collapsed, vomited, felt blood leak from my nose and ears and eyes, but I maintained the bindings, refused to release the structure I had woven around it. The struggle lasted hours, or days, or seconds. Time fractured under the pressure of that contest, became meaningless, became just another variable that could be rewritten according to the needs of the moment. Eventually, it yielded, not because I had overpowered it, but because it found the situation entertaining, because binding itself to my service for a limited duration offered amusement that outweighed the indignity of servitude. We negotiated terms, 7 years of service in exchange for considerations I will not detail here. Bargains struck in the darkness of that moment that set the trajectory of all that followed. When the ritual concluded, when the daemon dissolved into mist and reformed as a small gem that I was to carry on my person, I understood that I had crossed another threshold, had passed beyond another point of possible return. I had not merely studied forbidden knowledge, I had entered into active partnership with the forces that the Imperium's most dire warnings condemned as the ultimate enemy of mankind. I had become everything the Emperor's doctrine warned against, everything the Inquisition existed to destroy. The taste of copper and ash was now accompanied by something else, something sweet and rotten, like fruit gone to decay, like flesh softening into putrefaction. The taste came from within, I realized, not from any external source. It was the flavor of my own corruption, my own ongoing transformation from human into something other, something that wore human shape but housed increasingly alien consciousness. I had become a sorcerer, not in the dramatic, obvious way of the Chaos Space Marines I had read about in cautionary texts, not in the way of the corrupted warlords who led heretical uprisings on benighted worlds. I was a sorcerer who still filed archive documents, who still maintained the appearance of loyal service, who smiled and nodded in morning briefings and submitted requisition forms in triplicate, and adhered to all the petty bureaucratic requirements of imperial employment, while harboring in my chest a gateway to damnation, and in my pocket a Prenzart, daemon bound to my will. The daemon's name, translated as closely as possible into sounds a human throat can approximate, was Cthesarak. It manifested when I needed it, whispering advice, offering perspectives that no human consciousness could achieve, demonstrating abilities that I could study and, with time, learn to replicate through my own efforts. It taught me to walk unseen through spaces crowded with people, taught me to cloud minds and redirect attention, taught me to make myself unremarkable even as the changes to my physical form became increasingly difficult to disguise. The eyes were the first obvious marker. By the time I bound Cthesarak, the elongation of my pupils had progressed to the point where augmetic lenses were necessary to maintain the illusion of normalcy I told my colleagues that I had developed a rare optical condition requiring corrective implants. They accepted the explanation without question. Why wouldn't they? I was Hadrian Voss, reliable and boring, slightly eccentric perhaps, but essentially harmless, a fixture of the archive for over a decade. The idea that I might be something monstrous, something damned, never crossed their minds, because they lacked the conceptual framework to even imagine such a thing in the context of their familiar, safe environment. Exercise 31 taught me to perceive the warp signatures of individuals, to read the patterns of psychic energy that surrounded every human being like an invisible aura. Most people were dull, their signatures muted by lack of conscious psychic activity, by the same ignorance that kept them safely contained within the narrow boundaries of baseline existence. But some blazed brighter unsanctioned psykers, mostly individuals who had developed abilities but never reported them, never sought the black ships and the dubious salvation they offered. These people were walking time bombs. I understood now, their untrained powers constantly threatening to breach the membrane between materium and immaterium, to create apertures through which daemons could pour into reality. I could see them walking through the archive corridors, could see the instability that clung to them like a second shadow, could see the probability paths that led to their eventual catastrophic manifestation. I could have reported them. It would have been the responsible action, the loyal action, the action that might have returned some small measure of moral credit to my irredeemably compromised ledger. Instead, I watched them, studied them, learned from their unconscious mistakes, refined my own techniques by observing the clumsy inefficiency of their untutored gifts. One such psyker, a young woman named Seraphine, who worked in the mineral content analysis department, began showing signs of imminent breakthrough. Her signature fluctuated wildly, pulsing with barely contained energy, and I could see the attention her emissions were drawing from the warp, could see entities beginning to circle her like scavengers sensing dying prey. She would manifest within days, possibly hours, and when she did, she would likely kill dozens before security forces could respond, would tear a hole in reality that might take weeks to seal, would cause devastation that would bring inquisitorial attention to this forge world. Attention that I could not afford if I wished to continue my studies undisturbed. I approached her during a late shift, found her alone in one of the secondary testing chambers, surrounded by mineral samples that she was supposed to be cataloging but instead was staring at with visible distress, sweat beading on her forehead despite the chamber's carefully controlled temperature. She looked up as I entered, relief flooding her features. Anyone, to interrupt the private crisis she didn't have words to describe. "Are you all right?" I asked, though I could see the answer written in the warp currents around her, could see the fear and confusion that radiated from her signature in waves of purple and black. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I've been feeling strange. Seeing things, hearing things. I think I need to report to the Medicae, but I'm afraid they'll think I'm—" She paused, unable to voice the word. Insane, heretical, corrupted. Any of those possibilities could end her life, could see her purged or mind-wiped or sent to the black ships if they still made scheduled stops at this world. I should have helped her. There were still options, still possibilities that didn't end in damnation or death. I could have reported her to the inquisitorial liaison with a recommendation for evaluation rather than immediate termination. I could have taught her the basic mental disciplines that sanctioned psykers learned, the techniques for shielding consciousness from warp intrusion. I could have done something, anything, that acknowledged her humanity, her right to exist, her value as something other than an object for study and exploitation. Instead, I killed her. Quickly, efficiently, painlessly. She died without understanding what was happening, her consciousness extinguished in the moment between one heartbeat and the next. I used the techniques I had learned from Exercise 24, stopped her heart with a thought, caught her body as it fell, arranged her in a position that suggested natural causes. Then I consumed her psychic signature, drew all that wild, untrained power into myself through the gateway in my mind, channeled it into my own reserves, added her potential to my own. It was the most efficient solution, the most pragmatic response to a problem that threatened my security and my continued research. It was also murder, cold and calculated, the deliberate extinction of a human being for no reason other than convenience and the opportunity to grow marginally stronger. The demon whispered approval. The voices in my head sang praise. Some fragment of my former self screamed in horror, and was immediately silenced by the dominant consciousness that I had become. I felt nothing. That's what I remember most clearly about that moment, not triumph, not guilt, not even the satisfaction of a problem elegantly solved. I felt nothing. The capacity for moral emotion had been so thoroughly eroded by that point that I could commit murder and experience it as neutrally as filing a requisition form, as updating a catalogue entry, as any other mundane task that required completion. Her body was discovered the next day. The medici examination found cardiac failure, no signs of foul play, a tragic but not uncommon occurrence given the stresses of industrial labor and the questionable nutritional standards of Forge World existence. No investigation was launched. Seraphine was cremated, her ashes scattered in the designated memorial gardens, her work reassigned to others. Within a week, she was forgotten by everyone except perhaps her immediate family, and even their grief would fade, would be subsumed into the general background misery of imperial existence, would become just another small note in the vast symphony of human suffering that powers the Imperium's continued survival. I completed exercise 34 3 months later. This one taught me to perceive and manipulate the threads of fate, the probability structures that governed outcomes and channeled possibilities toward certain conclusions rather than others. The warp, I learned, was not merely a realm of emotion and thought, but also of potential, of futures that might be, of timelines branching and merging and collapsing in patterns that could be read by those with the knowledge to interpret them. I could see my own fate now, could see the probability paths stretching forward from my current position, and what I saw offered no comfort, no hope, no possibility of redemption or escape. Every path led to the same destination: complete corruption, absolute dissolution of self, transformation into something that could no longer claim humanity in even the most generous interpretation. The only variables were the timing and the specific nature of the final transformation. I was going to fall. I had already fallen. I was currently falling, had been falling since the moment I opened that cursed book, and nothing I could do would arrest that descent. The logical response would have been despair, or perhaps a desperate attempt to reverse course, to seek imperial clemency through confession and acceptance of whatever punishment such confession would bring. Instead, I felt a strange relief. The burden of choice had been lifted. If damnation was inevitable, if every action I took merely selected between different flavors of the same ultimate outcome, then I was free to pursue whatever path offered the most knowledge, the most power, the most complete understanding before the final dissolution. I was free to embrace the fall rather than fight it, to extract whatever value could be extracted from the experience of my own corruption. I completed the remaining exercises in rapid succession. Exercise 35 taught me to create permanent psychic constructs that could persist independent of my direct attention, to build structures in the warp that would continue to function and grow even while I focused elsewhere. Exercise 36 taught me to split my consciousness, to maintain multiple threads of awareness simultaneously, to exist in several locations at once, through the projection of psychic fragments that retained enough of my core identity to act autonomously within parameters I established. Exercise 37, the final exercise, taught me to unmake. That's the word the text used. Unmake. Not destroy, not kill, not eliminate. Unmake. to unwrite something's existence at such a fundamental level that it ceased to have ever been, that the universe's equations recalculated to account for its absence, that causality itself adjusted to fill the void where it had been. It was power on a scale that approached godhood, that suggested capabilities that the Emperor himself might have wielded in his prime, that offered the possibility of reshaping reality according to my will, rather than accepting reality's imposition on my existence. The text warned that this exercise could only be used once. The act of unmaking something would rewrite the sorcerer's own existence as well, would transform them fundamentally and irrevocably, would complete whatever corruption had been set in motion by the earlier exercises. After successfully unmaking something, I would no longer be Hadrian Voss in any meaningful sense. I would be something else, something new, something that had never existed before in precisely that configuration. The text did not clarify whether this transformation was punishment or reward, consequence or apotheosis. It simply stated the fact with clinical detachment and left the interpretation to the reader. I never performed exercise 37. That requires clarification. I never consciously chose to perform it, never deliberately set out to unmake something, never made the decision to complete that final step. But I had split my consciousness by then, had created multiple fragments that operated with varying degrees of independence, and one of those fragments, or perhaps several working in conjunction, decided to act without consulting what I still thought of as my core identity. The fragmentation had progressed further than I realized, had created genuine plurality, where I believed there was still singular control, and in the moment when I discovered what my other selves had done, it was already too late to prevent the consequences. They unmade the Forge world. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say, they unmade the concept of the Forge world, the entire category of planetary existence that it represented. I'm still not entirely clear on the scope of what occurred, on whether it was limited to that single planet or extended to every Forge world across the Imperium, whether reality recalculated to accommodate a universe in which that type of place had never existed, or merely adjusted to explain the absence of one specific example. I know that I left that world before it disappeared, or before I perceived its disappearance, or before the timeline in which I existed on that world ceased to be the primary timeline my consciousness inhabited. The sequence of events is confused, possibly deliberately so, possibly as a side effect of the unmaking process itself. What I remember clearly is waking in a place that was not a place, a space that existed between spaces, a pocket of reality carved from the warp but not entirely separate from it. I was alone, though the daemon gem still rested in my pocket, still pulsed with Kethasarak's presence. My body had changed. The transformation I had seen approaching in all those probability threads had occurred, had completed, had rewritten me into something that looked approximately human but functioned according to different principles, different rules, different equations. I could still think, still remember, still claim continuity with the person who had been Hadrian Voss, but the thing doing the thinking, remembering, and claiming was no longer that person in any substantive way. I have existed in this state for what I believe to be 7 years, though time functions unreliably in this pocket realm, and I cannot be certain that subjective experience correlates with external duration. I have continued my studies, have pushed beyond the 37 exercises, have developed new techniques and new applications of the principles those exercises taught. I have grown vastly more powerful in some dimensions, vastly more limited in others. I cannot return to the materium without extraordinary effort and preparation. I cannot maintain human form except through constant psychic exertion. I cannot remember my mother's face, or the name of my childhood friend, or the taste of actual food uncontaminated by copper and ash. I have become a thing of power and knowledge and absolute isolation, a consciousness trapped in a prison of its own construction. unable to progress further without losing the last fragments of identity that still bind me to what I was, unable to retreat without confronting the totality of what I've done, what I've become, what I've lost. The voices never stopped. They're louder now, more numerous, a constant chorus of suggestion and demand and mockery that fills every moment not occupied by active concentration on specific tasks. They claim me as their student, their servant, their puppet, their future. They promise greater power if I surrender the last vestiges of resistance, if I accept their full patronage, if I let them complete the transformation that has thus far remained partial. They promise oblivion if I refuse, promise that they will unmake me as casually as I unmade that forge world, will erase my existence from reality and replace me with something more compliant, more useful, more willing to serve their inscrutable purposes. I believe them. I don't believe them. Belief and skepticism have become equally meaningless in the face of their reality, in the face of my own dissolution. I record this confession for no reason I can articulate. There is no one to confess to, no authority that might hear this testimony and grant absolution or punishment or even acknowledgement. There is no redemption available, no path back to the Imperium and the Emperor's grace, no possibility of restoration to human community and human purpose. I record it because the act of recording, of organizing experience into narrative, of imposing structure on chaos, is perhaps the last human gesture I'm capable of performing. I record it because speaking these truths aloud, even to an empty chamber and a recording device that will never be recovered, maintains the fiction that I still exist as a discrete consciousness capable of self-reflection and moral evaluation. I was a librarian once. That's where this began, and that's where it ends, with the recognition that all my seeking after knowledge, all my scholarly dedication, all my intellectual pride led me to this exact point, to this exact state of being, to this exact moment of lucid damnation. The books warned me. The imperial doctrine warned me. The fearful whispers of lesser men warned me. I believed I was different, believed I was smart enough, disciplined enough, strong enough to study the forbidden without being consumed by it. I was wrong. I was wrong from the beginning, wrong in my assumptions about the nature of knowledge and power, wrong in my belief that understanding could be separated from transformation, wrong in my conviction that I could observe corruption without being corrupted. The taste of copper and ash is eternal now. It is the only constant in our existence that has become fluid, unstable, subject to revision and transformation without warning or consent. It is the flavor of truth, the only honest thing remaining in a consciousness built on lies, self-deception, and grandiose rationalization. It is the taste of damnation, and it is mine, and I have earned it with every choice I made, from the moment I opened that skin-bound book in a forgotten archive, on a forge world that may or may not still exist in the universe I currently inhabit. If you are reading this, if this recording somehow survived the dissolution of my pocket realm and returned to the materium, if it found its way into hands capable of understanding its significance, then know this: the path of the sorcerer offers no rewards that justify its costs, no knowledge valuable enough to balance against the loss of self, no power sufficient to compensate for the totality of what must be surrendered to achieve it. The Imperium, for all its cruelty and oppression and casual disregard for individual human suffering, is correct about this one essential truth. There are things humanity was never meant to know, powers we were never meant to wield, and the price for attempting to transcend those limitations is not merely death but something infinitely worse than death. I can feel the transformation approaching its next phase. The remaining fragments of Hadrian Voss are dissolving, being absorbed into the greater pattern of whatever I'm becoming, whatever the voices and the daemon and my own fragmented decisions have been shaping me toward all along. Soon there will be nothing left of the librarian, the scholar, the man who believed that mathematics could illuminate the darkness without being consumed by it. Soon there will only be the thing that wears his memories like ill-fitting clothes, that speaks with his voice, but expresses thoughts that are increasingly alien, increasingly inhuman, increasingly other. The book lied, not in its technical content, not in the exercises and techniques and formulations it presented, but in its fundamental premise, that power could be mastered, that knowledge could be controlled, that a human consciousness could negotiate with the warp and emerge with identity intact. The book was itself a tool of corruption, a carefully constructed trap designed to identify those arrogant enough to believe themselves exceptional, intelligent enough to follow its instructions, and foolish enough to think they would be the one to succeed where countless others had failed. I was not exceptional. I was merely another victim, another cautionary tale, another data point in the Imperium's grim statistics of damnation and heresy. If I had one message to convey, one final truth to speak before the last of what I was disappears entirely, it would be this. The warnings are not exaggeration, not superstition, not the paranoid overreach of a repressive regime. The warnings are desperately inadequate. The reality of corruption, the mechanism of damnation, the inexorable progression from first transgression to final dissolution, these things are worse than any imperial doctrine describes, worse than any fevered imagination could conceive, worse than I have words or concepts to express even now with all the power and knowledge I've acquired. Run from this path, burn the books, reject the voices, accept the limitations, embrace the ignorance, choose life, however brief and brutal and meaningless it may seem, over the eternal undeath that awaits those who follow curiosity into the darkness. But you won't listen. I wouldn't have listened. No one who would read this confession would listen, because the type of person drawn to such knowledge is precisely the type incapable of hearing warnings, incapable of accepting limitation, incapable of valuing the self they currently are over the self they imagine they could become. We are all doomed from the moment we ask the first forbidden question, from the moment we look at reality's boundaries and wonder what lies beyond them, from the moment we taste copper and ash and tell ourselves it's nothing, it's meaningless, it's a price worth paying for knowledge and power and transcendence. I was Hadrian Voss. I was a librarian on a forge world whose name I can no longer speak. I opened a book bound in human skin and covered in writhing text, and in that moment I stepped off a cliff from which there is no climbing back, no rescue, no salvation. I am falling still. I will be falling forever, and the taste of copper and ash will be with me through every stage of that eternal descent, the only constant, the only truth, the only honest thing in an existence built entirely on beautiful, seductive, damning lies. The recording ends here. Let it serve as testament, as warning, as the final gesture of a consciousness that once believed itself capable of mastery and learned, too late, that it was always meant to be consumed. Let it mark the space where Hadrian Voss existed before becoming something else, something other, something that perhaps deserves no name at all, except the one the voices whisper in the darkness. Forsaken, corrupted, lost. The transformation is complete now. I can feel it settling into permanence, feel the last threads of my former identity snapping under the weight of accumulated change. What comes next, I cannot say. What I will become, I cannot predict. What purposes I will serve in this new configuration, I cannot imagine. But I know with absolute certainty that whoever or whatever speaks from this body after this moment will not be Hadrian Voss, will not be the librarian who sought knowledge and found damnation, will not be anything that deserves to be called human in even the most generous interpretation. The taste of copper and ash is eternal. That will remain. That is the only legacy, the only truth, the only honest thing I can leave behind. Everything else is lies, illusion, the desperate fiction of a consciousness that believed it could transgress without consequence, that thought it could dance with damnation and walk away unburned. We are all lying to ourselves. Everyone who walks this path, everyone who opens the forbidden books and speaks the unspeakable names, and reaches beyond reality's boundaries toward the powers that wait in the darkness. We are all already falling. Some of us simply haven't looked down yet, and when you do look down, when you finally see the ground rushing up to meet you with terminal velocity, when you understand that the fall was always inevitable, and the impact will be total, and there is no possibility of survival or escape or redemption in that moment, you will taste copper and ash, and you will understand, and it will already be far, far too late. I was Hadrian Voss. Remember that name. If you remember anything from this confession, remember that I was human once, before I believed myself capable of more, before I sought knowledge that should have remained hidden, before I stepped off the cliff from which there is no return. Remember that I fell not from weakness but from strength, not from ignorance but from intelligence, not from despair but from hope and ambition, and the arrogant conviction that I would be the exception to every rule, the one who could succeed where all others failed. Remember, and let my fate serve as the warning I could not hear, the caution I could not heed, the wisdom I acquired too late to save myself, but perhaps, in time to save you. The taste of copper and ash. That is my gift to you, my final truth, my only honest legacy. May you never understand it the way I have come to understand it. May you never taste it the way I taste it now, constant and eternal and absolutely inescapable. May you never fall as I have fallen. May you never know what I have become. And if you do, if you find yourself on this path despite all warnings, despite all wisdom, despite everything I have testified here, then may you at least fall with eyes open, with full knowledge of what awaits, with no illusions about the price or the purpose or the final destination of this terrible, beautiful, damning journey into the darkness that calls itself enlightenment. The voices are singing now. The transformation is complete. Hadrian Voss is gone, dissolved, unmade by his own hand, and his own choices, and his own unquenchable thirst for knowledge that should never have been sought. What remains? Only the taste of copper and ash, and the endless, endless fall.